In November 1975, Edward Bindon stepped aboard as assistant engineer with his 25th wedding anniversary just around the corner. He'd already put in the order with a jeweler back home. A custom-ordered diamond ring, waiting for just the right moment. The jeweler was still working on it, but Edward wasn't worried. He'd be back in time to pick it up and see his wife's face when he finally handed it over after all those years together. Then came the night of November 10th. Edward went down with his ship into the icy depths of Lake Superior, taking all those anniversary plans with him. The ring got finished, but there was no one left to claim it. The vessel that became his grave carried a name now burned into Great Lakes history, the Edmund Fitzgerald. To understand what the lakes took that November night, you need to know what the Edmund Fitzgerald actually was. In 1957, the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company decided to diversify their investment portfolio in the most mid-century American way possible by building the biggest, fanciest freight hauler the Great Lakes had ever seen. The price tag was $8.4 million, somewhere around $100 million in today's money, which seems absolutely bonkers for what was essentially a floating truck designed to move iron ore from Minnesota to steel mills down lake. But Northwestern Mutual wasn't interested in building just another workhorse. They wanted the absolute maximum size that could squeeze through the newly opening St. Lawrence Seaway locks, which meant 729 feet long and 75 feet wide. Just 1 foot shy of the absolute limit. Think about that for a second. They cut it so close that if the welders had been slightly generous with their measurements, the ship would have been too big to fit through the locks it was designed to use. The vessel was named after Edmund Fitzgerald himself, the chairman of Northwestern Mutual, though apparently the man had the good grace to be embarrassed about it. He actually objected to having a ship named after him while he was still alive, felt it was too presumptuous. 3 seconds. But the board of directors voted unanimously to honor him anyway. Most ore boats of that era were built with all the charm of a floating warehouse. Bunks, a galley, maybe a radio if you were lucky. The Fitz was built like someone confused it with an ocean liner. We're talking full air conditioning throughout the entire ship, which was practically unheard of for a Great Lakes freighter. Crew quarters that were actually spacious, with tiled bathrooms and individual showers instead of the communal facilities standard on most boats. There was even a dedicated laundry room and recreation areas, because apparently Northwestern Mutual believed their iron ore deserved to travel in style. But the real extravagance was reserved for guests. The ship had 2 full staterooms. Not cabins, staterooms, 3S, decked out with plush carpeting, leather-upholstered furniture, and fine fabrics that belonged in a hotel, not a cargo hauler. There were 3 separate dining rooms, 1 for officers, 1 for crew, and 1 for guests, where the captain would host candlelit dinners with proper cocktails. Sailors who worked other lake boats would come aboard the Fitz and think they'd stumbled onto the wrong vessel entirely. It was excess for the sake of excess, a monument to an era when American industry still believed that bigger and better were the same thing. Of course, all that opulence almost didn't make it into the water at all. The Fitz's launch on June 8, 1958, was the kind of disaster that sailors would have recognized as a screaming omen if anyone had been paying attention. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, the chairman's wife, stood at the bow with a champagne bottle, ready to perform the traditional christening. She swung. The bottle bounced off the hull without breaking. She swung again. Still nothing. It took 3 attempts before the glass finally shattered, and anyone who's spent time around Great Lakes sailors knows that's about as bad as omens get. A ship that refuses its christening is a ship that doesn't want to be born. Then came the launch itself, which went from inauspicious to genuinely dangerous. When they gave the signal to release the ship into the Rouge River, the restraining blocks jammed. The Fitz just sat there on the slipway, thousands of tons of steel refusing to budge while workers frantically hammered and pried at the stuck mechanism. 36 minutes of this, 36 minutes of growing tension in the crowd, of whispers about bad luck, of executives checking their watches and trying not to look worried. When the ship finally did slide into the water, it created a wave so massive that it caught everyone off guard. Water crashed into the crowd of spectators, drenching them and collapsing a viewing platform. In the chaos and shock that followed, a man named Jennings B. Frazier collapsed from a heart attack and died. 8 seconds / greater than so before the Edmund Fitzgerald had even left the dock for the first time, it had already claimed a life. You'd think a launch like that would have been taken as a warning, but this was 1958, and American industry wasn't in the business of listening to superstition. The Fitz went on to have what looked like a spectacular career. Right out of the gate, she set a tonnage record on her very first trip, hauling more iron ore in a single run than any ship had managed before. Over the next 17 years, she'd break that record again and again, moving millions of tons of taconite and iron ore from the mines of Minnesota to the steel mills on the lower lakes. She earned the title Queen of the Lakes, and people would actually line up at the locks just to watch her pass through. Kids would wave from the shore, and under Captain Peter Pulser, the Fitz became famous as the singing ship. The captain would blast music over the ship's PA system and use a bullhorn to chat with folks on shore, turning a cargo hauler into something like a celebrity. The safety record looked impeccable, too. The Fitz won multiple awards for operating year after year without a single injury to the crew. A point of genuine pride in an industry where accidents were common enough to be expected. She was considered one of the safest, most reliable vessels on the lakes, a testament to both her engineering and the skill of the men who sailed her. But here's the thing about having a perfect record. It only takes one bad day to erase 17 years of getting it right. On the morning of November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets bound for Detroit. There were 29 men aboard, and each one of them had a life that mattered, plans that extended beyond that voyage, people waiting for them to come home. It's easy to reduce a maritime disaster to statistics: 29 lost, 530 feet deep, 17 minutes to sink. But those numbers flatten what was actually a collection of individual tragedies, each one devastating in its own particular way. At the helm was Captain Ernest M. McSorley, a man who'd spent 44 years working the lakes and had been a master since 1951. He was 63 years old, respected by his peers as one of the most competent captains on the water, the kind of sailor who knew these lakes like some people know their own neighborhoods. But McSorley ran a tight ship. He wasn't the jovial, music-blasting type like his predecessor, Captain Pulsar. He was all business, focused on efficiency and keeping to the company's schedule, which meant he had a reputation for being serious, maybe even a bit stern. What most of his crew didn't know was that his wife, Nellie, had suffered a stroke and was in a nursing home in Toledo. McSorley had confided in a few close friends that he planned to retire after the 1975 season so he could spend whatever time she had left taking care of her. This was supposed to be one of his last runs. Then there were the young ones, kids barely out of high school who saw the Fitz as a stepping stone to something bigger. David E. Weiss was 21. A cadet from the Great Lakes Maritime Academy doing his sea time, trying to earn his stripes. He was from California, which earned him the nickname Cowboy. And the disaster happened just 3 days before his 22nd birthday. Mark A. Thomas, also 21, worked maintenance and was apparently thrilled to be part of the crew on the mighty Fitz, proud to tell people back in Ohio where he worked. The youngest man aboard was Carl A. Hall, who was only 20 years old and saving money for college while nursing dreams of fronting a rock band. Bruce L. Hudson, 22, was an Eagle Scout and a musician who wanted to study journalism. Paul M. Reaper, also 22, was working the lakes to pay for nursing school. These weren't just crew members, they were kids with futures they were actively building, plans that required them to survive this trip and the next one and the one after that. Some of the men aboard that day weren't even supposed to be there. Robert C. Rafferty was 62. A steward from Toledo who'd been planning to retire but agreed to fill in for a sick friend on this run. Just one more trip, one last favor. Alan G. Coleman, 43, wasn't on the original crew list either. He stepped in to replace one of the regular cooks, Blaine H. Wilhelm was 51, an oiler and a World War II and Korean War veteran who'd seen his share of danger and survived it all. His first grandchild was born 4 days after the ship went down, a baby he would never get to meet. And then there was Edward Bindon, 47, the assistant engineer from Fairport Harbor with that diamond ring order waiting for him back home, counting down the days until his 25th anniversary. He had plans. They all had plans. I can't tell you every story from that crew in the space we have here. Each of those 29 lives would take hours to do justice to, and even then we'd only scratch the surface. But I need you to understand that aboard the mighty Fitz that morning were real people with real hopes, real love, real futures they believed were waiting for them. The Fitz wasn't alone out there, which is both a comfort and makes the whole thing more haunting. A few hours after she left Superior, the Arthur M. Anderson departed Two Harbors, Minnesota, under Captain Bernie Cooper, following the same route across Superior. The two ships stayed in radio contact, the way lake freighters do, checking in, sharing weather updates, keeping each other company across hundreds of miles of open water. Nobody knew it at the time, but the Anderson would become the only witness to what happened next, the last ship to see the Fitz before she vanished. The weather forecast that day was wrong in the worst possible way. The storm brewing over Kansas was supposed to track southeast, maybe clip the southern edge of the lake and cause some rough conditions, but nothing the ships couldn't handle. Instead, it swung north and slammed directly into the center of Superior with the kind of fury that earns storms names in sailor folklore. Winds hit over 90 miles per hour, hurricane force, and the waves built to heights that official reports put at 25 feet. Though Captain Cooper later said he was seeing swells between 35 and 40 feet, when you're talking about freshwater waves that size, you're talking about walls of water that can bury a ship's deck completely, the kind of seas that make even experienced sailors reconsider their life choices. Both captains recognized pretty quickly that this wasn't a storm you could just power through on the usual route. McSorley and Cooper agreed to take the northern track, hugging the Canadian shoreline where the islands and coastline might provide some shelter from the worst of the wind and waves coming out of the north. The plan was to use Michipicoten Island and the Ontario coast as a natural breakwater, then swing around Whitefish Point into calmer water. It was a longer route. Cost them hours they didn't really have to spare if they wanted to stay on schedule. But when you're looking at 40-foot seas, schedule becomes a pretty abstract concern. The northern route was their best shot at getting through this thing in one piece. What neither captain could have known was that the lake had already decided this wasn't going to be a routine storm. Superior has a reputation among sailors. They call November storms the Witch of November for a reason. The lake is deep enough and cold enough to generate its own weather systems, and when conditions align just right, it can produce waves that shouldn't exist in fresh water, seas that belong in the open ocean, not a landlocked body of water in the middle of North America. On November 10th, 1975, everything aligned wrong. At 3:10 in the afternoon, Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson with news that should have sent every alarm bell ringing. The Fitz had sustained damage, the fence railing along the deck had collapsed completely, and 2 ventilator covers for the ballast tanks were either gone or destroyed. In the understated language that lake captains use when things are going very wrong, McSorley described this as a little problem. But there was nothing little about it. Those vent covers were supposed to keep water out of the ballast tanks, and without them, the ship had open holes leading directly into her hull. Every wave that crashed over the deck was pouring water into spaces that were meant to stay dry. The Fitz was already listing to starboard, leaning to the right, which meant water was accumulating faster than it should. When Captain Cooper asked if McSorley had his pumps running, the answer was both reassuring and terrifying. Yes, both pumps were going full blast, but the water was coming in just as fast as they could pump it out. That's not how it's supposed to work. If your pumps are running at capacity and you're still taking on water at the same rate, it means you've got a serious structural problem somewhere. A crack, a breach, something that's letting the lake in where it shouldn't be. The likely culprit was 6 Fathom Shoal, a nasty stretch of shallow water near Caribou Island where the bottom comes up to just 36 feet. The Fitz drew 26 feet of water when fully loaded, which normally would leave 10 feet of clearance, plenty of room under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. Officers on the Anderson noticed that the Fitz had passed extremely close to the shoal, close enough that in 10 to 15-foot seas, the ship could easily have been lifted by a wave and slammed down onto submerged rocks. One good hit would be enough to crack the hull plating, and once you've got a crack in a ship that size taking waves over the deck, the water finds its way in. The list to starboard, the frantic pumping, the ventilator damage, it all pointed to a ship that had hit something hard and was now in a fight for survival. Then things got worse. About an hour after reporting the initial damage, the Fitz lost both radar systems, the primary and the backup. The most likely explanation is that massive waves had damaged or destroyed the radar antenna, but whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. The ship was now effectively blind in near-zero visibility, with snow coming down so thick you couldn't see the bow from the pilot house. A 729-foot freighter moving through a storm at full speed with no way to see what was ahead of her or around her. McSorley's last hope for navigation was the radio beacon at Whitefish Point, the lighthouse that marks the entrance to safer water. But the storm had knocked out power to the entire station. No lighthouse, no radio direction finder, nothing. The Fitz was running blind toward a coast she couldn't see, through seas that were trying to tear her apart, with no external navigation aids whatsoever. So McSorley did the only thing he could do. He called the Anderson. "Anderson, this is the Fitz. I have lost both radars. Can you provide me with radar positions until I reach Whitefish Bay?" Captain Cooper agreed immediately, and his crew became the Fitz's eyes, watching the radar screen and radioing course corrections to keep their sister ship from running aground or wandering off into the darkness. The one piece of navigation equipment that should have still worked was the radio direction finder, which could lock onto the beacon at Whitefish Point and give McSorley a bearing to steer toward. But the storm had other plans. The power went out at Whitefish Point, killing both the lighthouse and the radio beacon, which meant the Fitz couldn't use her direction finder even if she'd wanted to. McSorley radioed the Swedish freighter Avafors to ask if they could see the light. Captain Woodard confirmed he could see the tower itself, but the light was out. No help there. Captain Woodard later said that McSorley's voice sounded off during that conversation, like he had a bad cold, or like someone who hadn't slept in days and was running on fumes. At one point, Woodard heard McSorley shout over the radio, not to him, but to his own crew. "Don't allow nobody on deck." The waves were getting that bad enough that the captain was worried about his men being swept overboard if they stepped outside. McSorley told Woodard these were the worst seas he'd encountered in his entire career, and this was a man with 44 years on the lakes. When a sailor with that much experience says the conditions are the worst he's ever seen, you know it's genuinely hellish out there. What made it worse wasn't just the height of the waves, but the type of water coming over the deck. Sailors distinguish between white water and green water. White water is foam and spray, violent but relatively light. Green water is solid. It's the lake itself lifted up and dropped onto your ship, thousands of tons of water at a time, slamming down with enough force to buckle steel plating and flood companionways. The Fitz was taking green water over her bow, which meant every wave that broke over the front of the ship was adding massive weight and stress to a hull that was already damaged and listing. It's hard to overstate how dangerous that is. Imagine trying to stay afloat while someone keeps dumping dump trucks full of water onto your roof. At 7:10 that evening, First Mate Morgan Clark from the Anderson called the Fitz to warn them about another ship in the area. Then he asked the question that would become famous: how are you making out with your problems? McSorley's response has been analyzed and debated ever since. We are holding our own. Some people hear resignation in those words, a captain putting on a brave face while knowing his ship is doomed. Others hear genuine confidence, a skilled mariner assessing his situation and believing he can make it through. He even added a bit of sailor slang, going along like an old shoe, meaning everything's under control. We're handling it. Whether that was bravado or truth, we'll never know, because those were the last words anyone ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. 10 minutes later, at 7:20, the snow squall that had been blocking visibility suddenly lifted, and the crew of the Anderson looked ahead, expecting to see the Fitz's lights. There was nothing. They checked the radar. The target that had been there moments before, the ship they'd been guiding through the storm, was gone. Just empty screen where a 729-foot freighter should have been. Captain Cooper immediately called the William Clay Ford, another freighter anchored nearby, to check if his own radar and radio had failed. When they confirmed their equipment was working fine, Cooper realized what had happened. The Fitz was gone. Not damaged, not drifting, gone. He called the Coast Guard and said the words that would launch the largest search operation in Great Lakes history. I'm afraid she may have taken a nosedive. When Captain Cooper called the Coast Guard to report that the Fitz had disappeared, the response he got was not exactly what you'd hope for in a maritime emergency. The station at Sault Ste. Marie was preoccupied with searching for a missing 16-foot pleasure boat and didn't seem to grasp the magnitude of what Cooper was telling them, that a 729-foot freighter with 29 men aboard had just vanished from radar in the middle of a hurricane-force storm. The Coast Guard also had a practical problem. They didn't have equipment capable of operating in those conditions. Their small rescue boats couldn't handle 40-foot seas, and their largest cutter, the Woodrush, was hours away in Duluth. They had nothing to send. So they did the only thing they could do, which was ask the Anderson to turn around and go back into the storm they'd just escaped. Captain Cooper had gotten his ship and his crew through the worst weather he'd ever seen, had made it to the relative safety of Whitefish Bay, and now someone was asking him to deliberately take his men back into conditions that had just killed an entire ship. He hesitated, and who could blame him? But Cooper also knew that if the situation were reversed, the Fitz would come back for him. That's how it works on the lakes. You don't leave people out there. So the Anderson turned around and headed back into the teeth of the storm. One sailor on the Anderson was so convinced they were sailing to their deaths that he wrote out a last will and testament, sealed it in a jar, and kept it with him in case the ship went down. The only other vessel that joined the search that night was the William Clay Ford, which had been sheltering in Whitefish Bay and chose to brave the storm alongside the Anderson. Two ships searching through darkness and blinding snow for any sign of 29 men who might still be clinging to wreckage or huddled in a lifeboat somewhere. What they found instead, when dawn broke on November 11th, was a debris field, fuel drums, life jackets, oars, a massive oil slick spreading across the surface, and two of the Fitz's lifeboats, both destroyed. One had been torn completely in half, as if something impossibly strong had just ripped it apart. Neither boat showed any sign of having been launched. The damage suggested they'd been ripped from their davits when the ship went down, torn loose by the violence of the sinking. There were no bodies, No survivors calling for help, just wreckage floating on the surface of a lake that had swallowed an entire ship, and everyone aboard her so quickly that no one had time to send a distress call or deploy a lifeboat. It took months to find the Fitz herself. On November 14th, a Navy plane detected a magnetic anomaly on the lake bottom, and the Coast Guard cutter Woodrush used side-scan sonar to locate two large objects lying near each other in 530 feet of water, 8 seconds / greater than. But it wasn't until May of 1976 that a Navy remotely operated vehicle captured the first images and confirmed what everyone already knew. Those objects were the Edmund Fitzgerald. The ship had broken in two. The bow section was embedded nearly vertically in the mud, driven into the lake bottom like a spear. The stern section lay upside down about 170 to 200 feet away. Between them was a debris field, pieces of hull plating, cargo, equipment, all the things that get scattered when a ship breaks apart under catastrophic stress. The wreck told a story of violence, of a ship that didn't gradually settle to the bottom but plunged, broke apart, and slammed into the lake bed with enough force to bury the bow section upright in the mud. Whatever happened to the Fitz happened fast. So fast that even experienced sailors with decades on the lakes had no time to react. No chance to abandon ship. No opportunity to call for help beyond that final transmission at 7:10 saying they were holding their own. The lake kept all 29 men. Superior doesn't give up its dead. The water's too cold for bodies to decompose and float the way they would in warmer lakes. Whatever remains of those 29 sailors is still down there with the wreck, 530 feet below the surface, in water so cold and so dark that it's essentially a tomb. Half a century later, we still don't know for certain what killed the Edmund Fitzgerald. There are theories, plenty of them, and each one has its champions and its skeptics. But the lake kept its secrets, along with the men who went down with the ship. What we're left with is educated guessing. Forensic analysis of a wreck that's been sitting in freezing water for decades, and the testimony of the people who watched it happen from miles away. The most dramatic theory involves something sailors on the Great Lakes call the Three Sisters, a phenomenon where three massive waves hit in rapid succession, each one larger than the last. Around 6:30 that evening, Captain Cooper reported that the Anderson had been hit by two enormous waves, somewhere between 35 and 40 feet tall. That came over the stern and buried the entire aft deck underwater. Those waves were moving in the same direction as the Fitz, which means they would have hit her shortly after. If you've got a ship that's already damaged, already listing, already taking on water, and three successive waves lift your stern while driving your bow down, you can end up in a situation where the ship doesn't sink so much as dive. The bow plunges underwater. The momentum carries the whole vessel down, and suddenly you're in a nosedive to the bottom with no chance to recover. It would explain why the Fitz disappeared so quickly, why there was no distress call after that 7:10 transmission, why the wreck shows signs of such violent impact. Then there's the grounding theory, which suggests the Fitz signed her own death warrant when she passed near Caribou Island. Surveys done after the disaster revealed that the Canadian charts were wrong. 6 Fathom Shoal extended at least a mile farther than the maps showed. The Anderson crew saw the Fitz pass extremely close to that shoal, and if a ship drawing 26 feet hits the trough of a 10 to 15-foot wave in water that's only 36 feet deep. There's a very real chance the bottom of the hull is going to make contact with submerged rock. One good scrape could crack the hull plating, and once you're taking on water from below while waves are pouring in from above through damaged vents, you're fighting a losing battle. This theory explains the list, explains the collapsed fence railing, a phenomenon called hogging, where the middle of the ship gets lifted while both ends sag, and explains why the pumps couldn't keep up. The problem is that later dives to the shoal didn't find any paint scrapes or evidence of impact, though that doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. Some experts blame the design itself. Between 1958 and 1975, the Coast Guard allowed freeboard regulations to be relaxed, which meant ships could ride lower in the water and carry heavier loads. The Fitz was allowed to sit more than 3 feet lower than she had when first launched, which meant less hull above the waterline, less margin for error when waves start coming over the deck. Great Lakes freighters are built long and narrow to fit through the locks, and that shape makes them susceptible to a kind of flexing that can crack the hull under stress. Richard Orgel, a former crew member, once described watching the ship twist and flex in heavy seas, said the paint would crack and flake off the interior tunnel walls because the hull was moving that much. It's possible the Fitz broke apart on the surface, split in two from the stress of carrying too much weight in seas that were bending her hull beyond what it could take. The official conclusion from the Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board points to the hatch covers, the big steel lids that seal the cargo holds. Their theory is that these covers weren't properly secured or had failed somehow, allowing water to gradually flood the holds until the ship lost buoyancy and sank. This was the explanation that got written into the official report, and it's the one that made a lot of people angry because it essentially blamed the crew for not maintaining their equipment properly. The families of the men who died and the Lake Carriers Association pushed back hard against this conclusion, arguing that subsequent dives showed most hatches were properly secured and that computer models demonstrated the ship sank far too quickly for gradual flooding to be the cause. If the hatches had been the problem, the Fitz should have taken hours to go down, not minutes. The truth is probably some combination of factors, damage from grounding or structural stress, compounded by massive waves, complicated by a ship that was riding too low and carrying too much weight in conditions no one had properly prepared for. We'll never know for certain, because the only witnesses are dead and the lake isn't talking. When news of the Fitz's disappearance hit the papers, the jeweler who'd been working on Edward Bindon's anniversary ring learned that his customer was never coming back to pick up the order. He could have cancelled it, refunded the deposit, moved on to the next commission. Instead, he finished the ring, completed the work Bindon had commissioned for his wife's 25th anniversary, and made sure it was delivered to the widow. It's a small gesture in the context of such an enormous tragedy, but it matters. Someone cared enough to make sure that one piece of Bindon's plan, one fragment of the future he'd been building, actually made it home. The Fitz might have faded into obscurity, like thousands of other shipwrecks, if not for Canadian folk singer Gordon Lightfoot. He read about the disaster in Newsweek and the LA Times, and as someone who'd grown up around the lakes and done some sailing himself, the story haunted him. Lightfoot spent months researching every detail, writing and rewriting until he had 478 words that told the whole story. He worried that turning a tragedy into a song might be exploitative, that the families might see it as profiting from their grief. But when The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald came out in 1976, it did something remarkable. It kept those 29 men from being forgotten. The song hit number 2 in the United States, number 1 in Canada, and turned a Great Lakes shipping disaster into something like the Titanic of fresh water. When Lightfoot died in 2023, the Mariners' Church in Detroit rang the bell 30 times instead of 29, one ring for each sailor and one for the man who made sure their story lived on. The disaster forced the shipping industry to change in ways it had resisted for decades. Survival suits became mandatory equipment in every crew cabin before the Fitz. Sailors were expected to survive in Great Lakes water that would kill you from hypothermia in under an hour, with nothing but a life jacket. Weather buoys were installed across Superior before 1975. There wasn't a single weather buoy on the entire lake. Now there are 57. The Coast Guard stopped allowing ships to ride lower in the water for heavier loads, implemented mandatory annual inspections, and most importantly, changed the culture around storm avoidance. The old mentality was to power through weather to meet delivery schedules. The new understanding is that no cargo is worth dying for, and captains now shelter in port or hug the coastline when conditions turn dangerous. Since the Fitz went down, there hasn't been another fatal sinking of a large commercial freighter on the Great Lakes. Not one. The changes worked. Every November 10th, bells ring at the Mariners' Church and at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum 29 times, once for each man. Their names get read aloud, one by one, so that someone still says them out loud decades after they disappeared into the cold, dark water of Superior. The lake kept all of them. Superior is too cold for normal decomposition, which means bodies don't float to the surface the way they would in warmer water. The saying goes that the lake never gives up her dead. And in the Fitz's case, that's literally true. The wreck is a tomb, and it's likely to stay that way. What the Edmund Fitzgerald teaches us, if we're paying attention, is humility. We build these massive ships, engineer them to be unsinkable, load them with technology and expertise and decades of experience, and then the lake reminds us that none of it matters if the conditions align just wrong. 29 men went to work on a cold November morning expecting to come home in a few days, and the lake decided otherwise. The Fitz wasn't brought down by incompetence or recklessness. She was crewed by professionals, captained by a man with 44 years on the water, built to the highest standards of her time. She went down anyway, because sometimes the biggest ships still sink, and the only honest response to that reality is respect for the power of the water and the fragility of the people who dare to cross it.